Hey everyone, I'm back with another carry weight capacity of horses study analysis that I did, I think about 2 years ago in the summertime, that I'm just transferring from TikTok over here. So everything is pretty much the same. The summary will be at the beginning, and that'll be about the first 5 minutes of the video, and then after that will be an more in-depth analysis that I did a couple years back. So if you have any questions, let me know. Again, I'm just transferring these over from TikTok, so I did not do any change in, it's still like 9:16 instead of 16:9, whatever. So yeah, and if this type of stuff interests you, let me know. I'm happy to do more of these, but I just wanted to get this stuff over here because this type of long form content really fits better on YouTube than it does TikTok, so that's it. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys a brief summary of my issues with the influencer of rider-horse body weight ratio and rider-horse saddle fit on equine gait and behavior, the pilot study, by Estos and Adol. If you want the whole breakdown of the whole thing, I've got 5 or 6 parts of that will be posted. Otherwise, here is just the summary of what I don't like about it. Number 1, they decided to use the same saddle for all the riders, so the riders did not properly fit. Not all the riders properly fitted in the saddles that they were riding. Only 1, maybe 2 riders had a good saddle fit. And as we know, saddle fit can be pretty important for the horses, and most specifically, because the saddle fit was not ideal for the riders, some of the riders were unable to get a good alignment from the ear, shoulder, hip, heel alignment, which can affect how well they move, which can then affect the horse themselves. Number 2, they're a little cagey about what the saddle fit was for the horse itself. They said not ideal, but deemed adequate for what they wanted to do. And I have another piece about that I'll mention in a minute. The other issue that I had is that for 2 to 3 of the 6 horses did not have controls, meaning that the researchers took their owner's word that they could complete the exercise required of them, but they did not actually have the horses complete the test with 0 lameness. They did not abandon every single test, so the light and medium riders had low-grade inconsistent lameness, as opposed to the heavy and very heavy riders had higher grade lameness and more consistently, so they stopped the tests. But 2 to 3 of the horses, it's a little unclear in their data reporting, 2 to 3 of the horses showed lameness for every single rider, just not enough to necessarily stop the tests. So they say, and this relates back to the saddle fit as well, because they said the saddle fits were ideal because the light and medium riders were able to complete the tests, but they weren't able to complete the tests without any lameness. And that control is very important to looking at whether there's confounding factors that's causing lameness within the horses, such as saddle fit. So those were some of my issues. One of the signs that I don't necessarily think that this study is a good one in reference to the carry weight capacity of horses is that the heavy rider on one of the horses was the same weight as the horse's usual rider and owner, and but they were very different heights, and so the usual rider had tack that fit them, and so even though they were the same weight as the heavy rider, they did not, and the researchers did watch the owners ride, or the usual riders ride the horse, so, but they weren't necessarily looking for lameness, so it would appear, or it is not addressed, but more than likely the usual rider is able to ride sufficiently, where the heavy rider had to be stopped because of lameness, even though they're the same weight. So that has more to do with saddle fit and body proportions to the horse, the rider, horse, and saddle body proportions, all those together. Seems like that's more indicative of the issue and not necessarily just the rider's weight strictly. And as usual, I think they made kind of big claims for what their study was able to do. Yeah. I think that's basically a summary. So anyway, if you want more details, if you want a more in-depth analysis, you can go check out those other videos. Otherwise, this is the short version. So I would not say that this study gives us any indication of the horse's carry weight capacity. And once again, I would like to reiterate that there are, as far as I have found thus far, 0 studies on the carry weight capacity of a horse that is properly conditioned to the weight it's being asked to carry, and also the exercises it's being asked to do. So just keep that in mind. We're going to do the pilot study by Sue Dawson that was published in 2019 at the end of March. And this one gets talked about a lot because there have been other studies after this, but I see this one get referenced a lot because it indicated lameness at like less than 20%, like 15% body weight, rider's body weight to horse's body weight comparison. But we're going to go through this all together: green flags, yellow flags, orange flags, red flags. The title is The Influence of Rider-Horse Body Weight Ratio and Rider-Horse Saddle Fit on Equine Gait and Behavior, a pilot study. So once again, I'm going to skip the summary. This is basically literally just a summary of what they did. So we're going to go through all this information. This is the start of the introduction, and again, the introduction basically just goes through and summarizes all of the prior research that currently exists and what that prior research has indicated. The part of the introduction that I do want to talk about is in this very last paragraph. It says, the aim of this investigation was to assess gait and behavioral responses in typical non-elite competition riding horses undergoing a standardized exercise test when ridden by 4 riders of similar ability but different body weights. Perfect. So what this is saying is that the point of the investigation was to assess gait and behavioral responses in typical low-level competition riding horses with riders of similar ability and different body weights. Perfect. But then we get to this next line. The study design mimicked the situation that occurs. The study design mimicked the situation that occurs in many riding establishments and equestrian disciplines in which a horse or pony may be ridden in its usual saddle by riders of varying weights and body shapes. So this is a yellow flag to me. The reason is that they're asking 2 different questions that have to be controlled for separately. The first question is, does the rider's weight have an influence on the gait and behavioral responses in typical low-level competition riding horses? For that one, we have to control for saddle fit. Because if a rider is riding the horse in a saddle that is not properly fitted to both the rider and the horse may have behavioral and gait changes that are because of the saddle fit and not necessarily indicative of how much of the rider's weight they can carry. I hope that makes sense. The second question is, does having multiple riders of different sizes riding in the same saddle that may not be ideal for all the riders impact how a horse responds to the rider's weight? That's a separate question where we don't control for the saddle fit, right? So now we're asking 2 different questions that have to be controlled for differently. Now this is a yellow flag at this point, and it will become an orange or even a red flag down lower, because the proper way to control for this and to answer both of those questions is that you would need to run the test one time where all the riders have a properly fitted saddle to both them and the horse, or they're ridden bareback, or to somehow elsewise controlled for the saddle fit. And then after a week or 2 of rest for the horses, they redo the test with 1 saddle for everybody. And then see if there's differences there. And then they can explore the differences in the gait changes. Were those gait and behavioral responses present when the riders had a properly fitted saddle on, or only when they were in a non-properly fitted saddle? I hope that makes sense. Okay, so now we're going into the materials and methods. So what they did, sorry, I have notes. So if you see me looking down, I'm looking at the notes. So essentially the study riders, 4 riders of similar ability as determined by the British Horse Society. There was 4 instructors of varying ages, 49, 26, 56, 36. Similar ability, so they would have a similar history or be testing at about similar spots, but different weights. So they split them into 4 weight categories: light, medium, heavy, and very heavy. And we'll get a little bit more into that down below. And then there were 8 horses out of a group of 24. They selected 8. They mainly selected on absence of lameness in both in-hand walking and trotting, and also saddled walk, trot, canter by their usual rider, so their most common rider. So there were 6 in the test, and then they had 2 alternates in case they needed to eliminate one on the test date. This isn't necessarily important, but it's kind of interesting. So 3 of the 6 were warm bloods, 2 were cob types, 1 was a Lusitano. I'm sorry, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. And then their reserve horses was an Irish sport horse and a thoroughbred. So that gives you kind of an idea of what horses they were working with. And then the evaluations on lameness were done by the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeon Specialists in Equine Orthopedics, and they did lameness tests 6 to 8 weeks prior to the study, again, in-hand walk, trot, and then ridden walk, trot, canter by the regular riders, and then they would repeat those tests closer to the date of the actual study. So the rider-to-horse body weight percentages is listed down below, and it was the light rider was 10 to 12% of the horse's body weight. I don't remember if that included, well, it did include tack. So it did include tack later. I don't know if this section here is specifying with tack or without, but I know later they do measure everything with tack included. The medium was 12 to 15% of the horse's body weight. The heavy rider was 15 to 18%, and the very heavy rider was 18 to 20%. And so this part gets a little funky for me, and this is going to be a yellow flag, and it's going to continue to be a yellow flag and then turn kind of an orange flag later on. So the owners said that their horses were capable of being ridden on the bit for 30 minutes, predominantly in trot and canter, twice daily. They never actually tested that these horses could do that. They took the owner's word that it could, and this is a problem because this again lacks a control. We don't actually have proof that these horses can be ridden without lameness in these tests. We only have the owner's word that they can, so we don't have a control for these horses. Throughout the test, you'll see that some of these horses did get controls, essentially, where the lighter riders were able to ride the horses without lameness through the test, but there were 3 of the 6 horses, 2 of the 6 horses that never actually got a control, meaning that at no point did they ride through the test without any lameness. Every test they did had some amount of lameness in it. This is important because if all the horses are showing lameness no matter what, even if that lameness is exacerbated and made worse by the heavier riders, if all the horses are showing lameness, then that indicates that there's a confounding variable within the experiment. There's another factor that's coming in and making it so that these horses aren't capable of doing this exercise. And we don't really need a study to tell us that a heavier weight on the horse's back makes their lameness worse, because just like in people, you walk on your ankle every single day, but if you hurt it, you now can't put weight on it. So we don't we don't necessarily need a study to tell us that if a horse has an issue with lameness, then it will be made worse by adding more weight. That's a standard fact. So the fact that some of these horses don't have a control where they ran through the test without anything or without any lameness presented is a yellow flag. We're moving on to, we're still in the methods and materials section, moving on to saddle fit. And essentially this just says, so the master saddle fitters consultant, which will be referred to as CM throughout the rest of the study, made adjustments to improve the fit about, I think it was 6 to 8 weeks prior, I think. They checked the saddle fit for the saddles that they were going to use. They made some adjustments. And then they checked again. So what they didn't want was for the horses to enter the study with pre-existing pain because of a poor saddle fit. So they checked the saddle fits. It doesn't say what, I think it's their usual saddles maybe, and the horse's usual saddle. But they had the master fitters check the saddle fit, made some adjustments to try and minimize pain, and then on the day prior to the commencement of the study, the saddle fit was again rechecked, made a few more adjustments if necessary, and then throughout the study on all the days, the saddle fit was rechecked and abnormalities were recorded. So once the study started, they were no longer making adjustments to the saddle fit, they were only recording if the saddle fit wasn't perfect and what made it unideal. And then basically all the horses were stabled at the World Horse Welfare. And then before the day prior to the start of the study, all the horses were assessed in hand in straight lines at trot on a hard surface, and the presence of lameness was graded and recorded. They used a scale of 0 to 8. And then one horse was rejected because of a grade 4 out of 8 lameness in the right hind limb. Then all the horses were ridden in the indoor arena by their usual rider or the light rider to familiarize themselves with the study test environment. This does not mean that they were ridden in any any way, shape, or form close to the test. So them being ridden in that arena is not a control to prove that they could in fact complete the test. The test ride, they just were familiarizing themselves with the arena. And then they took measurements of the riders, the horses, the tack, etc. So then on the study days, the horses were weighed, and so were the riders, wearing their riding equipment and with their tack. And then this is just explaining how they got their data. So they used inertial measurement units and custom-built pouches that were attached to the horse, and they used tape to make sure that the placement was consistent throughout the test. And the inertial measurement units were to test the stride length and to keep data on the stride gait and asymmetry. So essentially what they're looking at is that in the horse's gait, there is a certain amount, the gait ideally should be symmetrical between legs and sides of the horse. There's a certain amount of asymmetry that is allowed. It is not considered lameness, but once you get above that, it's considered lame. So that's what the inertial measurement units were looking at, was connected to a computer, and they were taking electronic measurements and then sending it through the computer via Wi-Fi to basically just see how symmetrical or asymmetrical the horse's stride were based on who was riding them. And then prior to each procedure, they were trotted in hand in a straight line for 40 meters twice on the arena floor. The IMUs were taken and the gait assessed at that point, so that was their idea of a control, which again isn't the same thing as having a control of the full test essentially, which they did not have, or something akin to the full test, because they did the trotted in hand in a straight line, but the test involved walk, trot, canter for 30 minutes. They also used force mats underneath the saddle, and they had tape on the horses to keep placement consistent. The test that they used was a 30-minute test, a standardized test that all the riders were familiar with, and it involved walk, trot, canter in both straight lines, circles. I think that was it. Okay, so now we're getting into the subjective assessments that they used to determine lameness in the horses. So one of them that they used was a lameness test So the assessment of gait was performed continuously throughout the test by one of the coordinators. It looks like Sue Dyson was the one who did it. The presence and grade, or the lameness was graded on a scale of 0 to 8 in walk and trot. And if the horse reached a grade of 3 or higher in one limb, then they eliminated them, then they stopped the test right then and there. They stopped the test by blowing a whistle. The rider immediately halted, dismounted. So that was 3 out of 8 on the scale for one limb, and then it was 2 out of 8 in 2 limbs or more. The other way that they could stop a test before it was finished was if the horse showed the presence of, I have to check my notes. So there were 24 possible behavior markers for pain, and if the horse displayed 10 or more of the 24 behavioral markers, they would stop the test immediately. So I just want to talk really briefly about the use of behavioral markers for pain. It is a studied thing. There's nothing wrong with it, but just to give you an idea of what kind of behavioral markers they are, they're looking at things like tail lashing, mouth agape, things like that. And, maybe I'll do this, but those types of behavioral markers, now I've never gone through and counted them, but those types of behavioral markers are really, they exist, like, in dressage, a non-zero amount. So all of these pictures that I'm going to show you are from the FEI's Facebook page, so these are the pictures that they choose to market their dressage competitions. But here's one of a tail lashing. Another tail lashing. This horse's mouth looks like it was open a little bit. It's kind of hard to tell. It might have been, I'm sorry. I counted that as kind of a mouth gaping. It's just open. Here's another tail. Tail and a little bit of the mouth open. You can see the mouth open in this one. Tail. Tail. This one was the mouth. So my point about this is not that dressage horses are always in pain, although I think it would be interesting, and maybe I'll do this. I'll go through and screen record a dressage test off of YouTube and then count the number of behavioral markers. And this is why we use 10 out of 24 behavioral markers, because just a tail lashing doesn't necessarily mean they're in pain. The 10 point that they picked was their moment of saying, okay, we think the horse is in pain because of these 10 behavioral markers. But my point is that that's kind of what they're looking for in it, and you see these types of behavioral markers all over every equine thing. So there's a lot of study behind it and things like that. So anyway, and then they did record the time within the tests of any unexpected events like a horse spooking or saddle movements were recorded. And then for the physiological assessments, they recorded the respiratory rates pre and post exercise. They recorded the heart rate throughout the entire exercise. They did equine temperature, pulse, and respiratory rate recorded before and after the exercise. Heart rate was recorded continuously, and then saliva was gathered for cortisol concentration before and after the tests. And then also they did palpations for pain and took thoracic measurements pre and post test. And then if a test had to be abandoned, the horse would be reassessed 45 to 60 minutes after the abandonment of the test with the trot in hand to determine if the lameness had lasted. Which again does not mean that they're redoing the test to make sure the horse could actually complete the test. They're just looking for signs that the lameness is lasting longer than 60 minutes. The test order was randomized, and we'll just get into it immediately. All the heavyweight and very heavy tests had to be abandoned. And so they had to change the test order, and they did not have as much data for the heavy and very heavy riders. When they had to redo the randomized test order to make up for the fact that heavy and very heavy didn't have as many tests, they made sure that each horse was ridden one time for 4 days, and then 2 times on a 5th day. And if ridden twice, the horse always had at least one of the riders was the light rider, and they had 3 hours between their tests. And the riders rode up to 3 times a day, and they always had an hour in between each ride. That's kind of how they did their test. So then we get into the ANADA data analysis, which is down there for this, and this is it's getting to start in the interesting part. So first of all, most of the data presentation is descriptive. That's standard. 2 of the confounding factors that they found was that, number 1, it was an unequal saddle fit. Not all of the riders had an ideal saddle fit. Most of the riders, the saddle fit was actually pretty poor. For the horse, all they really specify is that the horse's saddle fits were not ideal, but they don't specify how not ideal, and that's a yellow flag to me, because if we look at saddle fit on a scale of like A, B, C, D, the way I had explained to me by a friend who interned with a saddle fitter for a while before having to move away from that saddle fitter, is that if we graded on a scale of A, B, C, and D, a B- saddle fit might not be ideal, might not be the right saddle fit for, say, cantering or jumping or anything like that. But if you're just doing like walk, trot, intro stuff, a B- saddle fit is fine. But they don't really specify what not ideal means. Are we talking like it's an A- B+ range where it's probably, gonna work for what we're doing, and not be and not affect it too much? Or are we talking like, the B- where a walk, trot, canter might be a little too much for that saddle? They don't specify. What they do specify is that because the saddle fit was unequal and the number of tests for the heavy and very heavy riders was less, they had to do multiple one-way ANOVAs. That's just a statistics thing. And essentially, so I did have to ask my husband, he's a data analyst, so this is what he explained to me this means. So the data was treated as individual per horse. So they took all of the data for the light, heavy, medium, and very heavy riders on one singular horse, and that is one group. But they were not able to run the data or run any analysis between horses. So each horse is its own individual data set, but as a group, all of the horses and all of the horses' rides together could not be analyzed. It had to be individual per each horse. I hope that makes sense. For what data they got out of it, that's fine. I'm not worried about that. But that's just something to bear in mind, is that the horses as a whole were not run or treated as a group or representative of a horse population. Again, this is just a pilot study, so I don't think that's a yellow or an orange or a red flag at all. This is just talking about the dimensions of the rider and the horses. And again, these tables are the riders and the horses' dimensions, so like height, weight, various pole. They didn't actually use any of this data, so like to see, like in the last study that we talked about, they were talking about whether cannon bone circumference might be indicative of what the carry weight capacity of a horse is. They weren't looking for this, so this was just information that they pulled, but they did not really do any analysis regarding the measurements of the horse. Same thing here, we just have another table. Okay, so I've skipped ahead to the table where they specify what was wrong in the saddle fits for all the riders. So for horse number 1, and again, I don't know the breed, they don't specify which breed of horses which horse number. Horse number 1, for the light, medium, and heavy riders, the length of the saddle seat relative to the rider was correct. However, only the light rider on horse number 1 had the rider's shoulder, so you know when you ride a horse, you're supposed to have your ear, your shoulder, your hip, and your heel in alignment. They made it more specific to the tubercoax, but it's their hip area that they're talking about. So only the light rider on horse number 1 had correct alignment of ear to shoulder to hip to heel. And then the very heavy rider, the saddle seat was too short and they didn't have correct alignment. This is important because the reason that you have to sit in that correct alignment is that you need your hip flexors at the top where your upper thigh connects to your hip and into your spine and everything. When you're sitting in like a chair seat, as you'll see some of these riders had to do, it shortens those muscles in the front and elongates them in the back and makes it harder for you to move around. So if you've ever done squats, you know that getting up off the couch is more difficult than just doing a squat because of that chair position. Even if you go as low in your squat as you would be sitting on a couch, it is more difficult to get up off the couch than it is to do a squat, because in a squat you have to be in a good alignment and it keeps the muscles in the right length and makes it easier to move around. So what this means for trotting is that when you're doing a rising trot, which is what they did in this study, they did all rising trots, if you are in a chair seat, you won't have the flexibility of movement that you would have if you were in the correct alignment. And that could, theoretically, change how the horse responds to your movement. And you'll notice that all the test abandonments were in the trotting phase, where the rider would have been trying to rise and do a posting trot in a way that's not the correct way to do a posting trot. So that's why this is important, and that's why not having an ideal saddle fit, one of the reasons why not having an ideal saddle fit for the rider could make a big difference in how the horse responds to and is able to carry their weight, especially at different gait. So horse number 2, light and medium, had the correct saddle length, and they had the correct alignment. The heavy rider saddle was too short, very heavy, very short, and neither of them had correct alignment. Same thing with the third horse. Light and medium had the correct saddle length and the correct alignment, whereas the heavy and very heavy weight riders were short and did not have correct alignment. For horses 4, 5, same thing, light, medium, correct saddle length, correct alignment. Heavy, very heavy, short saddle length, incorrect alignment. And then for horse 6, the light rider and the medium rider both had correct saddle length, but the medium rider did not have correct alignment. And as usual, both the heavyweight and the very heavyweight riders did not have correct saddle seat size and alignment. And then it kind of keeps cutting my pictures off, but this top one you can see what this incorrect seat alignments look like. So this light one on this side, on the very far left of your screen, is the correct alignment, and then on the very heavy rider you can see that chair seat, which would have messed with her ability to do a correct posting trot. And we just went over the alignment for the riders. So then down here they essentially taped the horse and where the riders to show if the rider, the saddle, and the horse's spine were all in alignment throughout the ride. Okay, so now we're going to get into the subjective observations. Some lameness was exhibited in the pre-test trot up. So the first horse 1 had a 1 out of 8 grade lameness in the left hind limb. Horse number 3 had a 1 out of 8 in the right hind. Horse 4 had a 1 in the right hind. Horse 5, 1 right hind. And horse 6 had 1 out of... So horse 6 on 2 separate occasions had a grade lameness of 1 in the right forelimb and then 1 in the left forelimb. So they had 2 instances of right forelimb grade 1 lameness and 1 instance of... sorry, I said that wrong. So horse 6, actually I wrote down my notes wrong, had 2 separate instances of lameness, both grade 1, one in the right hind limb, one in the right forelimb. Left hind limb. Oh my gosh. Horse 6 had grade 1 lameness in the right forelimb in one occasion. And then at a separate trot-up test occasion, they had a grade 1 in the left hind limb. In all other instances during their trot-up tests, the horses showed no lameness. Okay, so I'm going to give you an overview of this table, and then I'm going to put it up for you to look at. But, so in the first 3, I believe, horses, Very Heavy and Heavy, had to abandon the test for various reasons. That's listed here. But the horses also showed lameness in the both the light riders and the medium riders tests during that day. The lameness was generally grade 1 or grade 2, and was not always consistent with the lameness showed on the Very Heavy and Heavy riders. But this is what I mean when I say some of these horses had no controls done. So, for instance, horse number 1 showed lameness at just a grade 1 lameness in the light and medium riders, and then the test was abandoned for both the heavy and the very heavy riders, meaning that these horses did not have horse number 1 did not have a single test where they ran through the entire test or the equivalent of the test clean with no lameness observed. However, it is important to note that the lameness that was shown in the light and medium riders was very low grade lameness, and it wasn't consistent throughout the whole test. And they did complete the tests with the light and medium riders. They just did not complete it with no lameness shown. And that, I feel, is an important control in this study. Okay, so horse 1 was abandoned by the Very Heavy rider for grade 4 of 8 lameness. And it tells you when, and I think all of these were in the various trot portions of the test. And then the heavy rider, horse 1 was abandoned because they had 10 of the 24 behavioral markers in the canter this time. The second horse, heavy, was abandoned due to a grade 3 of 8 lameness, and Very Heavy was abandoned due to 3 out of 8 lameness in one limb, the left forelimb, and 4 out of 8 lameness in the right forelimb. And then again, for horse number 2, the light rider had grade 2 lameness, grade 1 lameness in a different limb, and the medium rider had a grade 2 lameness, my goodness. And then the heavy rider, before the abandonment of the test, did show a grade 1 lameness. Okay, so horse number 3, abandoned for Very Heavy because of grade 4 lameness, abandoned for the medium rider, this time 2, with the grade 3 lameness, again at the trot, heavy, grade 4, and then the light rider, they did show grade 2 lameness with the light rider, but was not abandoned. And then horses 4 and 5 did not show any lameness. I think 4, 5, and 6 did not show any lameness with the other riders, but were abandoned for lameness. There's 6 with the Very Heavy, but they didn't show any lameness. And it is important to note that horses 3 and 4 did complete their tests, so they were abandoned for lameness by the heavy and Very Heavy riders. So horses 3 and 4 did complete the test later with the light rider, and may or may not have shown lameness. He didn't specify. So 2 of the horses did not have a control. If we're being generous, I guess, and saying that horse number 3 that showed lameness completed later, we have 2 to 3 horses that did not have a control of a performed test with no lameness exhibited. because I think the number 4, or horse number 3, I think the light rider test that they completed later did have lameness shown. So, and then all the horses were tested afterwards for 45 to 60 minutes after test abandonment, and all of them trotted up fine. Okay, so this is just the objective gait stuff. I'm going to kind of breeze through it because none of it's like super important. Essentially, the only important part of the objective gait analysis is that the IMU data showed no patterns, except that there's more variability in heavier riders. The way they phrased that was really weird. It's down here at the bottom. The IMU data varied considerably among rider with no consistent patterns. However, the magnitude of asymmetry appeared greater for the heavier. That's a yellow flag to me because technically they're not wrong. So essentially, there's no pattern. The asymmetry of the gaits, there's no pattern to where the asymmetry was, but, where in the test they found the asymmetry, etc. However, they did find that the asymmetry was greater with the heavier riders. So that's not really a pattern, but it's something worth reporting. But the way that they phrased it made it sound very biased. Like, there's no pattern in the asymmetry, but the heavy riders had more asymmetry, so we're going to put that, the way they phrased it was poor. It's not necessarily wrong, but they phrased it in a way that reveals some bias, or could reveal some bias. Okay, so we're just going to very quickly, there's a lot of tables that just show the asymmetry of the horses. And again, there will be a link for this in the comments, so you can go look through all of this yourself. Here's something interesting about the saddle fit. So for horse number 2, the owner and the heavy rider had identical rider and horse body weight percentages, and similar weights. They were like 1 kilogram apart. But they were very different heights and had a different saddle fit, and so the horse's normal rider has not had any issues with riding his horse, even though he has the same percentage as the heavy rider, whose test had to be abandoned. So that does indicate that it was more of a saddle fit issue, and that the saddle fit was the confounding variable, and we can't really draw, that's an indication that we can't draw a lot of conclusions about the actual horse's carry weight capacity. So anyway, all these results are just the straight data, and then they also talk again about some prior studies that were done on other horses. They also talk briefly about the design of this pilot study does not allow us to determine which of the two factors is more influential, the rider weight as a proportion of the horse's weight, or the rider position on the saddle or the horse's back. Although they do acknowledge that that is a function of rider size. They do acknowledge that part of the reason that they chose not to change the saddle size for each rider was because the saddle size needed for the very heavy rider, lengthwise, would have gone past the 18th thoracic in the spine, and that it's general consensus that you shouldn't go past that with your saddle, although there are some saddles that are shorter on the bottom and then kind of go out like floating over that, and there's really not a lot of study as to how that affects the spine of the horse. But generally speaking, part of the reason that they didn't choose to go with different saddles is that they would not have been able to find a saddle that fit the very heavy. They would not have been able to find a saddle that fit the very heavy rider in length that also would have been an appropriate size for the horses that they were using in the study. There's a lot to unpack there. I don't find that to be a yellow flag. I understand why they opted for that, but that doesn't change the fact that there's no way to know if the saddle fit would have made a difference, especially when, like I said earlier, the heavy rider and the owner of one of the horses have the same weight but different heights, and so the owner fits the saddle better than the heavier rider does, or the owner has a saddle that fits both them and the horse well, and the heavy rider didn't, and the heavy rider had to abandon the study even though they're the same weight as the owner. So BMI, it doesn't matter. They did run that, and they did run that analysis, and BMI does not matter, which is not at all surprising. So basically they just talk about that the body length, or like the body makeup of the rider might matter, because again, the heavy rider and that owner were the same weight, but very different heights. And so the body proportion, the body proportions of the rider versus the horse and the saddle, all of that together might be more indicative of whether or not a horse can carry your weight, i.e., where does the rider's leg fall on the horse, and how does the rider fit into the saddle. All of that together may be more indicative. We don't know, but that's kind of what they're looking at. Like, you have to consider rider height, leg length, upper body length, different body proportions, and figure that into the saddle. And so just taking 4 people and plopping them in a saddle doesn't necessarily, and that's the way that they're phrasing their discussion is kind of weird, because they said we deliberately elected not to use different saddles because there are a lot of situations in which horses don't use different saddles. And I get that, but like I said at the beginning, now we're testing 2 different questions that have to be controlled for differently. So you can't effectively test both of those situations, the carrying capacity of the horse versus how does the rider to saddle fit affect the way that a horse responds to the weight that they're carrying. You can't test both of those in the same study because they require different controls. So that was my orange flag. Actually, to be honest, it's kind of a red flag at this point. They're talking about why they deliberately elected not to use different saddles, and then this is where they talk about how some of the saddles that were sufficiently large for the very heavy rider would have extended beyond the 18th thoracic vertebrae in all of the horses, which is not an ideal saddle fit. Anyway, so the tests were done predominantly at a trot and a canter. Their owners were confident that they were able to achieve. They do acknowledge that some of the horses had a high body score, like 5, which was 3 and 5 of the horses had a high body score, which was 8 and 7.5, and that could have affected their performance because they're not exactly fit horses. And again, I just would like to put a disclaimer. I will never tell you to just go put 50% of a horse's weight on the horse and make it work without properly conditioning your horse first. Just like when humans go to the gym, you don't go to the gym and immediately start lifting 200 pounds. You start low and work your way up as you condition your body to be able to hold that kind of weight. It's the same thing with horses. When you have heavier riders, even if we don't know, or even if through these studies we don't know exactly what the carry weight capacity of a horse is, you still can't just go and toss a bunch of weight on a horse and expect it to carry it. You have to condition it properly. So when working with heavy riders, the horse needs to be conditioned to carrying that kind of weight. And this they kind of address when they say it is important that we not encourage people just to overfeed their horses to get a better rider to horse body weight ratio. So retrospectively, they considered the fitness adequate for horses 1, 2, 4, and 6, and borderline for horses 3 and 5. But both horses 3 and 5 were able to complete tests with light and medium riders on the same day that they had test abandonments. But again, for horse number 3, that was not necessarily a test without any lameness. They still showed lameness, but it was inconsistent and low grade with the rider. With the light rider, or the medium rider. Horse 5 was able to complete the test without any lameness at all, as was horse 6 and horse 4. Then they also talk about how previous studies weren't quite the same as this one because the exercise was done on a treadmill, which is very different than arena work. The horses were done with one rider, and then weights were added to the saddle artificially with the same rider just to test the different things, and that is different than how the horse interacts with a different body type, where the weight lays and how the weight moves is different when it's human weight versus when it's just lead weight. Although the last study that we talked about, the 2008 one, did have a study that indicated that horses react the same way regardless. I'll do a walkthrough of that one too, because I think that's an interesting study. They talked about some horses that were done on Arabians, on Japanese native horses, and things like that, and a lot of those tests were done over short distances, essentially saying why their test is different and better to answer the questions that they pose than these other tests were. And then in this study, they did observe lameness in most of the horses when being ridden, which had not been apparent in hand, and that is reflective of another study from 2016 that basically just said, yep, horses can show no lameness in hand or on a lunge, and then when being ridden, they show lameness that wasn't apparent before. They did decide that because the lameness was low grade and transient, i.e. it wasn't consistent with the light and medium riders, it was deemed acceptable for continued work, but not for the heavier riders. And again, they acknowledged that saddle fit to the rider may be different. And again, they have not specified how not ideal the saddle fit was for the horses, so I'm having a hard time with that because they keep talking about how the saddle fit not being good for the riders may have made a difference, but they haven't actually said how not ideal the horse's saddle fit was. More than likely, it means that it was probably mostly ideal and was just a little off, but that raises questions for me. And maybe I missed it. I've read this study 4 times. Maybe I just missed it. That's very possible. They talked a little bit about the fact that the riders weren't in proper alignment, which I talked about. They again reinforced their decision to use different saddles because there's a high proportion of ill-fitting saddles in the general horse population. Okay, here we go. In the current study, despite attempts to improve the fit of owner's tack prior to the study, saddle fit to the horse was not perfect, but was considered adequate for the purposes of the investigation. That's what they leave it at. That seems very vague to me. They argue that because the horses performed satisfactory with the riders light and medium. I disagree with the horses that did not ride a clean test. They say that's satisfactory and therefore the saddles were a close enough fit. That's a yellow flag for me. Yeah, okay, so I just talked about the saddle fit being a yellow flag because they said something about it wasn't ideal, but it was close enough, and the horses did mostly okay with the light medium riders, and the saddle fit was probably fine. That's a yellow flag. Something sounds fishy there. They do acknowledge that in future studies, a panel of professional saddle fitters would probably be better. Okay. They did talk about the 10 behavioral markers of pain. They did some of the markers retrospectively, which is kind of odd because they were worried about using real-time may result in underscoring because some of the features like eye closing is more difficult to determine during than while watching the video recordings. And all of that data, as well as the salivary cortisol concentrations, pulse and respiratory rates, blink rates, all of that was reported separately. So that is not contained in this study that I'm going over. It was reported on separately. And I might go over that stuff too, because I think it's interesting that they chose to report that separately when those should have been. If the horses had higher salivary cortisol concentrations, higher pulse and respiratory rates, and things like that, with the heavy riders, that would have supported their conclusion. But I guess I wouldn't call that a yellow flag. It's just something that I think is interesting that they chose to report it separately. I guess it wouldn't. The original question was gait symmetry and behavioral responses. So the salivary cortisol concentrations don't necessarily fall under either of those, so I guess it makes sense they reported it separately, but if it did any heavy lifting in supporting their conclusions, I think they would have included it, is what I'm kind of getting at. But I could be wrong. Then they talk about like the 2008 study, the cannon bone circumference, some suggestions that might make a difference. They said this study did not, they said the 2008 study was of low power and therefore the conclusions are questionable. Told you. And then they said how their horses did not agree with that study. I have feelings on that. That's not important. Moving on. The results of the study are not necessarily applicable to lower level activity. So, like, if you're just... if you are a heavier person, and I know plenty of people are heavier people that don't actually want to, like, seriously ride in, like, competitions and things like that. They want to go on trail rides and love on their horses and do walking around and maybe a little bit of trotting and things like that. This is not applicable to that. They're talking about competing, like walk, trot, canter. You know, we're not talking high-level competitions, but, you know, walk, trot, canter, doing patterns and things like that for 30 minutes at a time is different than just going out for, you know, nice hack for a while, you know, whatever. So this isn't applicable to very casual riders that have their trail horse and that's all they kind of do. And they also specify that this does not apply to more fit horses, nor those that have been slowly adapted to weight carrying. And that is so important, because when we are talking about the weight carrying capacity of a horse, we absolutely have to acknowledge that at this point, from what I've found, and I've been looking through a lot of these studies, there are no studies that indicate what the weight carrying capacity of a fit, conditioned horse is. We have no idea. So this doesn't mean that you can go and hop in, like I said, put 50% of a horse's body weight on it and ride it around and go jumping on it, on just any horse. But if you are properly conditioning your horses and slowly making them more accustomed and, again, conditioned, I've said that word a bajillion times. If you are slowly conditioning your horses to your weight, there's absolutely no studies that indicate that a horse cannot safely go above 20% of their body weight. Zero, zilch. That is so important. It has been suggested that fit, appropriately conditioned Arabian endurance horses are able to carry 20 to 30% of their body weight for 100 miles. It has also not been studied, but anecdotally, there have been instances seen in Mongolian horses where those horses are carrying up to 100% of their weight. There's no studies to show pain or stress levels or anything like that. So, but anecdotally, Mongolian people will have their animals carry up to 100% of their weight, and the animals are able to function that way. Are they able to function well? Again, it's not studied, but that's 100% of their weight. Okay. So, similarly, the results of the current study cannot be transferred to more intense work either. The other thing that's important to note here is that these were professional dressage riders riding non-professional dressage horses, and if you have seen how professional dressage riders ride, and the horse is not accustomed to that style of riding, that could have affected the results as well. So again, we have 0 studies so far that I found. If you know of one, toss it to me and I'll look it over. 0 studies on horses that are properly conditioned to the rider size or even the type of riding that they're doing. None. It's on horses that aren't necessarily conditioned to this type of riding and aren't conditioned to the rider size. So they have clearly demonstrated deleterious effects of inappropriate rider size on equine gait and behavior. I wouldn't go that far because of all the things that I've talked about. The horses aren't conditioned. The saddle fit wasn't ideal. The results suggest that any adverse influence of less than ideally fitting tack for horse or rider may be accentuated by riders who are heavier and or taller. that's a fair statement. So that first statement I think was a little far. The second statement, fair to what they have, to what their data suggested. The results of this study do not mean that heavy or tall riders should not ride, but suggest that if they do, they should ride a horse of appropriate size and fitness with a saddle that is correctly fitted for both horse and rider. Accurate. I would question the appropriate size because, again, nothing has really indicated the size aspect, but it is absolutely true. The results of heavier, taller riders should ride a horse of appropriate fitness with a saddle that is correctly fitted. Further work is, however, required to determine if horse fitness, greater breed adaptation to heavier weights, more ideal saddle fit, etc. would help increase what a horse can carry. Last statement's fine. That is my analysis of this particular study. Okay, thanks for sticking with me, guys.